Welcome to Vision News Today, your window to the world's latest stories and breaking headlines. Stay updated with global events, politics, and insights that matter. Don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell, so you never miss the vision of today's news. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's sweeping tariffs, declaring he overstepped his constitutional authority. The justices ruled that the power to levy tariffs rests with Congress, not the president, fundamentally reshaping American trade policy. This decision dismantles a central pillar of Trump's economic strategy and forces a dramatic re-evaluation of U.S. engagement with global trade partners. The ruling brings relief to American businesses and consumers, while reaffirming the separation of powers at the heart of American democracy. The Supreme Court has drawn a clear line. The president cannot unilaterally impose taxes without explicit authorization from Congress. President Trump made tariffs the centerpiece of his second-term trade policy, signaling a dramatic shift in how the United States would approach its economic relationships with the rest of the world. Rather than relying on traditional diplomacy or multilateral agreements, Trump chose to wield tariffs as a primary tool, aiming to protect American industries and jobs from what he described as unfair foreign competition. He imposed broad duties on a wide range of imports, arguing that these measures were necessary to defend national security and restore balance to America's trade deficit. The tariffs affected everything from steel and aluminum to consumer goods, impacting both large corporations and small businesses across the country. Relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law originally designed to address threats from abroad, the administration claimed that persistent global trade imbalances and alleged unfair practices by other countries justified sweeping new tariffs. This interpretation of the law was both bold and controversial, as it expanded the president's authority far beyond its traditional use. This was a novel use of a statute typically reserved for targeted sanctions against hostile nations or specific threats, not for broad economic policy affecting entire industries and trading partners. Legal scholars and policymakers debated whether such a sweeping application was even constitutional. The move sparked fierce opposition from American businesses, who saw tariffs as a tax on consumers and a threat to supply chains. Many business owners and industry groups warned that higher costs would be passed on to American families, and that retaliatory tariffs from other countries could hurt U.S. exports and jobs. Despite the backlash at home and escalating retaliation from trading partners abroad, Trump remained steadfast. He viewed tariffs not just as a defensive measure, but as a powerful bargaining chip in negotiations, using them to pressure other countries into making trade concessions and rewriting agreements in America's favor. This aggressive approach set the stage for a major legal showdown over presidential authority, raising fundamental questions about the limits of executive power in shaping the nation's economic future and the role of Congress in overseeing trade policy. The legal challenge at the heart of this case revolved around a fundamental question. Did the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, truly grant the president the authority to impose tariffs, or was this a power reserved exclusively for Congress? The Constitution is clear that the power to levy taxes and duties, including tariffs, is a core legislative function. Yet the president's use of the IEPA in this context raised concerns about the boundaries of executive power. Plaintiffs, including business groups and legal scholars, argued that Congress never intended the IEPA to serve as a backdoor for broad tariff authority. They pointed out that the law was designed to give the president tools to respond to international emergencies, not to bypass Congress's explicit constitutional role in regulating commerce and setting tariffs. Their legal filings emphasized that if the president could use emergency powers to impose tariffs at will, it would undermine the careful balance of powers established by the framers of the Constitution. They warned that such a precedent could open the door to future abuses, allowing any president to sidestep Congress on critical economic decisions. The administration, on the other hand, countered that the IEPA's broad language was intentionally crafted to give the president flexibility in times of crisis. They argued that regulating international commerce, including the use of tariffs, was a necessary tool for protecting national security and responding to unforeseen threats. The case quickly escalated into a fundamental dispute over the separation of powers. Challengers cautioned that allowing the president to unilaterally impose taxes would set a dangerous precedent, eroding the checks and balances that are the foundation of American democracy. The Justice Department responded forcefully, insisting that a narrow reading of the IEEPA would severely limit the president's ability to act swiftly in a crisis. They maintained that Congress had deliberately left the statute open-ended to ensure the executive branch could respond to emergencies without delay. Ultimately, the courts were faced with a profound decision. Where does executive power end and legislative authority begin? The outcome would not only determine the fate of the tariffs in question, but also set a lasting precedent for the balance of power between the branches of government. The legal fight began in the lower courts, where a district judge blocked the tariffs, finding the president's use of the IEEPA an overreach. The Federal Circuit Court affirmed that the law didn't authorize global tariffs, but allowed them to remain in effect pending Supreme Court review. This created legal limbo. Tariffs continued despite being ruled unlawful. Both sides appealed, recognizing the immense constitutional and economic stakes. The Supreme Court moved quickly, scheduling arguments for early November. The business community and international partners watched closely as the case reached its final chapter. The stage was set for a historic Supreme Court showdown over presidential power. The Supreme Court sided with the challengers, ruling Trump's tariffs unlawful under the Major Questions Doctrine. The court found that the IEEPA lacked clear, specific authorization for such sweeping economic action. Justices emphasized that Congress, not the president, controls trade and taxation. Transforming an emergency powers law into a tool for global tariffs, they said, required explicit legislative approval. The decision reaffirmed the separation of powers and limited executive authority in economic policy. The court made clear it was not judging the wisdom of tariffs, but who has the right to impose them. The authority to levy broad tariffs, the court concluded, belongs to Congress alone. The ruling fundamentally shifts power over trade back to Congress, ending years of executive dominance in tariff policy. Presidents can no longer unilaterally impose broad tariffs under vague emergency powers. The White House must now work with Congress to shape trade policy, requiring negotiation and compromise. This change complicates future trade deals and forces lawmakers to take responsibility for U.S. economic strategy. The decision empowers Congress but also challenges it to legislate effectively in a polarized environment. The court's endorsement of the Major Questions Doctrine sets a high bar for future executive actions. The era of using emergency powers for sweeping economic change may be over. The recent tariff ruling is just one front in a much broader and ongoing battle over the scope of presidential power, a battle that has come to define the second term of President Trump. Throughout his time in office, Trump has repeatedly tested the boundaries of executive authority, often pushing the limits of what previous presidents have attempted. His administration's bold and sometimes controversial executive actions have triggered an unprecedented wave of legal challenges. Hundreds of lawsuits have been filed by states, advocacy groups, and private citizens, contesting everything from sweeping policy changes to the president's use of emergency powers. Many of these high-stakes cases have now made their way to the Supreme Court, where justices are being asked to weigh in on the very limits of presidential authority. The legal challenges are wide-ranging, touching on issues like immigration policy, the control and independence of federal agencies, and the fundamental question of how much power the executive branch should wield. Each case has the potential to set important precedents that could affect not just this administration, but all future presidents. The Supreme Court's recent decision on tariffs is a clear signal that the justices are willing to enforce constitutional boundaries, especially when they believe the president is encroaching on powers that the Constitution reserves for Congress. This ruling may be just the beginning of a new era of judicial oversight. Other major cases, particularly those involving immigration enforcement and the independence of federal agencies, are still pending. The outcomes of these cases could have far-reaching consequences, potentially reshaping the way the executive branch operates and interacts with the other branches of government. The rulings handed down in this period will not only impact the current administration, but will also shape the presidency for decades to come. They will set new legal standards and clarify the limits of executive power, influencing how future presidents govern and how the balance of power is maintained in Washington. Ultimately, the legacy of this era will be a redefined balance between the branches of American government, a legacy forged in the courts, and one that will echo through the nation's political system for generations.